All right, this is our second video on Intro to Genetics. So hopefully by now you've already finished the first one. You should go back and do that if you haven't already. So what we're going to be looking at today is we are going to be looking at modeling inheritance patterns in genetics. So we know that through meiosis, your genes are going to separate where you only end up with one copy from mom's in a sperm cell or egg cell, one copy from dad's in sperm cell or egg cell. Of course, mom's will be in an egg cell, dad's will be in a sperm cell. Then you'll get one from each. So we're going to look at how can we predict from what mom has for her genes and dad has for his genes, what we might see in the offspring. So I keep using this term, and I used it a lot last time, simple Mendelian genetics. So I want to declare for you guys, what is simple Mendelian genetics? So what it is these are traits where a single gene is going to code for them. So here, an example of a simple Mendelian. Now, this is not actually a simple Mendelian trait, but it's a nice diagram, points out kind of the clear sort of point I'm trying to make here. So they have brown eyes versus blue eyes. So eye color does have more than one gene involved with it, but for today, we'll do a little pretend. So what they're showing you is that there's one gene that controls for this blue eye versus brown eye. So if you take a look right here, this would be a heterozygous individual. They got blue from one parent, brown from the other. They will have brown eyes because that is the dominant trait. Here you have a homozygous dominant. They got brown from mom, brown from dad. Because all brown they has to work with, they are dominant as well. So they're going to look like their phenotype will be brown eyes. So a person who under simple Mendelian genetics has at least one of the dominant traits, their phenotype is going to be whatever the dominant allele is. So a heterozygous individual will show as having brown eyes, and a homozygous dominant individual will show as having brown eyes. With recessive alleles in simple Mendelian genetics, the only way that you see them is if the person is homozygous recessive, meaning they have to have two copies of the recessive allele in order for it to be shown. Think of kind of your dominant alleles in simple Mendelian genetics as being like bullies. If there's one of them around, they're going to kind of repress your recessive trait so you won't see it. Now, there are a lot of traits. The vast majority of traits that we have when you look at a person are not controlled by just one gene. So they do not follow simple Mendelian genetics. But for the introductory purposes of today, we're going to be looking at traits that do and using examples of that. We'll get into a little later some dihybrid crosses and look at some more interactions of genes. But for today, we're looking at one gene controlling a trait. So Mendel, we know that his work was with pea plants. So here's an example of some of the simple Mendelian traits that he picked. Now, we talked last time about how he got a little lucky in the sense that he didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know anything about chromosomes. He was just picking random traits, and he happened to get lucky in the sense that he picked traits that only have a single gene that controls them. So one of the things he looked at was seed color. He also had seed shape, round versus wrinkled, seed coat color, white versus gray, flower position, so axial, you can see axial means they're on the side, versus terminal, those are going to be on the top. Stem length, tall versus short. Your pod shape, so here's inflated where they're kind of puffed up, and then constricted where you can kind of see that it's a little indented around where the peas are. And then last but not least, pod color, yellow versus green. Today we're going to be using some of Mendel's traits that he looked at. So we're going to be using pod color, yellow versus green for our examples, and we're going to be using seed shape, round versus wrinkled. So the way that we model simple Mendelian inheritance is by using a tool known as the Punnett square. Now, the Punnett square is a model to predict the results of a genetic cross. And when we take a look at this, there are a lot of misconceptions about what a Punnett square tells us. But a Punnett square only works for Mendelian genetics. So it only works when there is a single gene that controls a trait. You cannot use a Punnett square to figure out what the color of someone's skin will be because there are so many genes that control that. It only works for traits where there's one gene that controls them. So here's an example of what mom may have to give. So we're looking at, if we were to look at a somatic cell in mom. So mom is going to have the dominant characteristics. So if you look right here, I'm using capital L's to represent our green pea pods, which are dominant. And I'm using lowercase l to represent yellow pea pods, which are recessive traits. So mom is homozygous dominant, meaning that on her gene, where it codes for pea pod color, she only has a dominant green pea pod to give. Whereas dad, he is recessive, so he is yellow. So that means he only has yellow pea pod color to give. So when these divide through meiosis and they form their two new gametes down here, so here's mom's egg possible combinations, here's dad's sperm, we're going to look at what's going to happen when these combine. So when a random egg cell combines with a random sperm cell, what are the chances of what we're going to see in our offspring? So here again is your drawing of what sperm and egg might look like. So the way that you do a Punnett square, and you've all seen this before hopefully, is we draw this little window pane looking thing where we have 4 squares, and we're going to take one parent's genotype. So genotype again is the letter that represents what alleles they have on their genes. So what's actually being told in the genes here. And here's dad's genotype. So we have to make sure we do one parent on each side. So here's mom. She gives one L possibly in one of her eggs, one L in the other one. And there's dad, his sperm, whether it's this one or this one, can only give the trait for yellow pea pod color. Now to fill this in, you just take each one down. So you bring mom's big L here, dad's little L here, mom's big L comes down here, dad's little L comes in here, and you fill it in by basically following mom's down for each row and dad's across for each row and mom's down for each column until we get this. So now this, a lot of people see this and they think that it means that you're going to have 4 offspring and this is what they're all going to look like. That's not what a Punnett square is telling you. A Punnett square is basically giving you your odds. What's the chance that we're going to be able to tell what an offspring might look like? What should they look like if they're following really our Mendelian inheritance? So once you have this, you filled in mom's across one side, doesn't matter if it's top or bottom, and dad's across the other, doesn't matter if it's top or bottom, as long as mom is next to mom and dad is next to dad. If you put dads here next to moms, that's wrong. Now you're going to do some calculations. So the first calculations you need to do are genotype. So genotype, remember you're looking at your letters. So I see here that between my 4 possible offspring that I could have made with mom's genes and dad's genes, I see that every single one of them is going to be heterozygous. So 4 out of 4 are big H, little h, which means that 100% of the offspring will be heterozygous. Now phenotype is what you're going to see. So yellow, I have 0 that are going to be yellow. Now what I would see here if I were going to have any yellow is I would have to see little l, because that's the only way we get a recessive trait. Now I have 0 that have little l, so that means I get 0 yellow, and 4 out of 4 are going to be green. All right, you guys are going to try this on your own now. So you're going to use a different trait. You're going to use round seeds versus wrinkled seeds. So round seeds are dominant to wrinkle seeds. Here are your genotypes. Mom is homozygous recessive. So what is her genotype? So I want you to take a minute, write it down, and then you're going to answer the question. Good. So hopefully you got that. I'm using the letter R here to represent this. You can use whichever letter you want. However, I suggest that you use letters that look different as capital and lowercase. So O's are not a good letter because I can't tell if you're drawing a small capital O or if it's just confusing. So choose letters that look different. So I used R. So you should have chosen little r for mom. Dad is heterozygous. So what's his genotype? Good. Hopefully you were able to get that heterozygous. We don't need to know if it's heterozygous recessive, heterozygous dominant, because heterozygous means you have 2 different ones, one capital R, one lowercase r. Now you're going to create a Punnett square for the cross of a homozygous recessive mom and heterozygous dad. So in your notes, draw in your Punnett square. You're going to do your calculations and then answer questions 3 and 4. So I would pause the video here and then come back and answer them when you're ready. So hopefully you've done your calculations by now. Question number 3, what percent of the offspring will be homozygous recessive? This is a question of genotype. Good, so hopefully you got that you are going to get 50% are going to be homozygous recessive, 50%. Now, number 4, what percent of the offspring will have round peas? Good. So hopefully you were able to get that you have 50% of your offspring are going to be heterozygous, meaning that because they have at least one of the dominant traits, their phenotype, which is what question 4 is asking you about, is going to be round. What you guys are going to do now is you're going to pick up your Punnett square practice and complete this for homework. Any questions you have, message me on It's Learning, and I will answer as quickly as I can.